and welcome back to the second part of our four-part music appreciation series presented by the Northern Neck Orchestra. My name is Michael Repper, and I'm the music director of the Northern Neck Orchestra of Virginia, and I'm so proud to be the host of this series. In our first video, I discussed briefly the historical context in which Western European music arrived in the Baroque era. We discussed how the textures of both sacred and secular European Baroque music was influenced by the Church, specifically in the modal frameworks, Gregorian chants, which came centuries earlier, and in the cantus firmus. Secular music, such as dances, reflected the ever-repeating nature of these lines, and we exhibited this with a performance of Bach's famous Chaconne for violin. Please check out the previous episode if you missed it. Today, I'd like to talk about another very popular form of mainstream European Baroque composition, the fugue. It's my intention that by the end of this episode, you'll be able to identify a fugue when you hear one, in the hopes that you might appreciate their beauty more each time. Before I break down a famous fugue for you, let's talk about texture. Generally, music between the 17th and 19th centuries can be divided into two main textural categories. The first is homophony, or homophonic music. And this comes from the Greek homo, meaning same, and phonic, meaning sound. In homophonic music, there is one prevailing melodic line, and all other sounds are harmonic, serving to support the melody. You're all very familiar with this kind of music, for example, in Mozart. Listen to how there's only one melody in my right hand and one harmony in the left hand. Let's listen to it one more time together. This in all kinds of music. For example, here in ragtime, listen here how there is one melody supported by the harmony below. This is The Entertainer by Scott Joplin. Homophony is also the dominant texture of composition used today and throughout the last 100 years of popular music. Typically, you'll have one melody, for example, the lead singer, supported by a band, which provides the harmony. If you turn on most pop radio stations or rock and roll radio stations or country, folk, most music being written today is homophonic. And while Bach did sometimes write music that leaned a bit towards homophony with very complicated texture, a far more significant amount of his work was done with what we call polyphony, or with a polyphonic texture. Polyphony means many sounds, or in this context, many voices. In polyphonic writing, rather than having one dominant melody supported by a harmony, composers wrote many co-equal voices, which, by nature of moving independently of each other, generated harmonies with each other. These harmonies are not always as crystal clear as they would be with a homophonic texture, as we heard in Mozart or perhaps the Beatles. But that's not a negative. Think of the beautiful Gothic buildings being built around this time. The complexity and intricacy of art around this time, around the Baroque time, is what makes the music special and beautiful, and it's how we can identify it for its time. And Baroque fugues are a haven for some of the greatest polyphony of all time. Take a listen to a brief snippet of one of Bach's fugues. It's likely difficult for you, listening to this, to pick out one dominant melody, and that's by design. Bach actually writes here three completely independent voices, each with its own focus and each with equal importance. The complexity is the beauty. And despite its complexities, there's actually a very easy system by which anyone can identify a fugue and know its structure. That way, next time someone performs a fugue for you, you'll know what to listen for. A fugue is essentially a musical interplay or exercise between three or more voices. By voices, we're referring to each independent musical line. Because each voice typically plays only one note at once, they could actually be sung by different people. And in practice, composers were actually heavily influenced by choral music, again, because of the weight of church in society at Bach's time. Let's examine the structure together of one of Bach's most famous fugues, the C minor fugue from the first book of his Well-Tempered Clavier. This is the same piece as I played at the start of this episode, and it's a three-voice fugue, which means that there will be three independent and equally important voices interacting with each other. A fugue will always begin by stating a melody. I'll say that one more time. You can always identify a fugue because it starts by stating a melody. In this case, it begins in the alto voice, and here it is. In a fugue, we call this voice the subject. Listen to it again and try to memorize the way it sounds. It's very singable. This subject will be the basis of the entire fugue. Think of the subject as perhaps the main character of a book or a movie. If you remember it from the beginning, you'll be able to follow it all the way through the piece. Now, after the first voice enters with the subject, a second voice will enter with the exact same subject, transposed into the dominant key. Here again is the subject we know, played in the alto line, the first that we hear. And here is the answer, played in the soprano line. Sound familiar? Well, now, while the soprano line is singing the subject, the alto line, which was the first to enter, doesn't just stop. It continues with what we call a counter subject. Listen to the two of them together. First the alto. Now the soprano. Now, as I said, this is a three-voice fugue, so we would expect that there would then be an introduction of yet a third voice who sings the subject. And in fact, there is. Several bars later, we hear the tenor sing the subject. Here it is. And now we'll play from the beginning. You should be able to hear each successive entrance. First in the alto, then in the soprano, and then in the bass. I will play each voice out so you can easily identify them. First the alto. Soprano. Tenor. Play that one more time so you get the idea. This time I won't call out the voices and you can identify them yourself. In this section of the fugue, the opening section where we hear all of the voices that the composer is going to introduce, is called the Exposition. And you want to remember that word because it carries us through so much music, even in later centuries. The Exposition. And it's a formula that stays constant through nearly all fugues, no matter the composer. To prove it, I'm going to play the exposition of yet another one of Bach's fugues. This again is a 3-voice fugue, and it's also one of my absolute favorites. Listen to first the subject in the soprano, which is answered by the subject in the alto, and then finally in the tenor, and see how each voice acts independently of each other, creating harmonies by the pure nature of being heard at the same time. Also, this subject is quite a bit longer, so it's a bit more to get used to. Did you hear it? I'll do it one more time and I'll call out the voices as they enter. First, in the soprano. This is the alto. Really fun music to listen to all of these voices interacting with each other. Now, after the exposition, the fugue is, again, a compositional exercise of the beauty of the interplay between these voices. You'll hear what we call sequences, or patterns that repeat themselves but in different keys, like this one. This is the main structure of the pattern. Take a listen. And now we hear it again, just in a different key. And again in a different key. And now yet again in a different key. And again. This is what we call a sequence in music. It's when you take a pattern and you repeat it in many different sort of structures or different keys. I'll play it again. This one is also very special because it's trading off between the soprano and the alto. Listen just to my right hand. First you hear it in the soprano, then the alto takes it. Soprano. Now alto. Soprano. Alto, soprano. I'll play it again with the texture. Meanwhile, the tenor. Boom, 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 boom. See how that works? In every few bars, one of the voices will restate the theme that we're all familiar with. Again, it's this. And every few bars, that will come back. It'll just emerge out of the texture. Listen here to the subject in the soprano line that's going to come just out of that same sequence that I just played. Here it is. I'll play it one more time so you can catch it, okay? as the piece continues, this pattern will repeat itself. We'll hear sequences or patterns of musical material where the voices play with each other creatively. Also, episodes, which are longer sorts of sections where the voices continue to play with each other. And then a restatement of the subject in one of the voices. It always pops up someplace different. So when I play it again, listen carefully. And before I play the entire piece, there's one other important trait about this fugue. It's really critical to mention because composers continue to use it and used it throughout the classical period and the Romantic period as well. And it's something that occurs very much in music. It's called a coda. A coda is a section of music written at the end of a piece that serves to resolve the tension built up in the music that would otherwise be left unresolved. You might think of music as a rubber band, okay? Music has tension and resolution. Tension and resolution. Sometimes, however, at the end of a piece, there will be a big cadence, a big resolution, but there still won't be total relaxation and total resolution. Well, we know that rubber bands can't act that way. They can either be tense, and if you let go, it has to be completely relaxed. I think music, especially around Bach's time, is just about the same. So, such is the case at the end of this fugue. Take a listen. I'm going to lead us up to the end, but not quite play all the way to the end. I'm just going to play to where it could finish. Take a listen. Do you see how the music doesn't feel completely resolved? Feels like there should be more? Well, Bach answers this plea by writing a short coda. At the end, we feel much more resolved. And here's what it sounds like going all the way to the end. Much more resolved, feels much more relaxed. Well, now I'm going to play the entire fugue from start to finish, doing my best to play each subject out when they happen. Try to count how many times you hear the subject in its entirety throughout the piece, and overall, just have a good time listening. you enjoyed this episode of our music appreciation series. It's always so fun to delve into such great music. And if you're enjoying these videos, please consider making a donation to the Northern Neck Orchestra through the links below. Such donations are incredibly helpful to sustaining the orchestra while we cannot perform live due to the COVID crisis. And we hope you tune in next time, where we'll delve into the classical era. Thanks for watching.